At the intersection of science and consciousness is Dr. Marilyn Schlitz. Her bio is extraordinary. Let me read it for you. Dr. Schlitz is an acclaimed social scientist, award-winning author, and sought-after public speaker. She has conducted clinical, laboratory, and field-based research into consciousness, human transformation, and healing. Her books include Living Deeply, Consciousness and Healing, and Death Makes Life Possible. And there's a companion film, award-winning film, that goes along with that book. Having taught at Stanford, Harvard, and Trinity University, she is currently professor of transpersonal psychology at Sophia University. She is professor emeritus and senior fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, that's the Edgar Mitchell Group. Schlitz has published hundreds of articles in scholarly journals and popular publications. She has lectured extensively in diverse venues, including the United Nations, the Smithsonian Institution, the Commonwealth Club, and for groups across the globe. In our interview, we talk about her rather long and an extensive journey into researching consciousness. We touch on some of her major findings that she had in this research, and in particular, I liked our discussions about intention and worldview and the transformational change model that she developed. We end our conversation with a discussion about the psychomantium, which is a device that was developed by Dr. Raymond Moody to address grief and healing. This is a terrific interview. I know you'll enjoy it. Stay tuned for Dr. Marilyn Schlitz. Marilyn, it is wonderful to have you here on the Afterlife Files. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved with consciousness and consciousness research?
Yeah, maybe it's always been a part of me. I had an experience as a toddler. I was, dressed in my cute pink jammies, exploring the world as an 18-month-old does. And I discovered a can of lighter fluid and put it in my mouth and a good empiricist. And that led me in and out of intensive care. And, I think that gave me a sense of, not that I remember any of that, but, a deep affinity for the health professionals, the healers, the doctors, the nurses, the candy stripers. So I've always had an appreciation, and it's led me, I think, to a lot of the research I've done. When I was 16, I was with somebody I shouldn't have been with at a time when I shouldn't have been out on the back of a motorcycle at closing time of the bar. And we got hit by a drunk driver. And that was, a pretty profound experience, watching my body tumbling through the air and landing with a thud. And I ended up with 66 stitches in my left leg. And so that gave me a sense of, consciousness maybe being something beyond the physical. And then I remember being at home in my parents' living room and visualizing my body healing. And I don't know where that came from. My father was a tool and die maker. My mom was a housewife. I didn't come up in a medical family. But I had this idea that if I could harness my imagination to move my immune system through my body, that perhaps I could enhance my healing. And I remember laying there feeling the tingles going up and down my leg. And so again, it gave me a sense that consciousness may be something that we can harness and that there are powers and potentials there. And then I guess, I grew up as a kid in Detroit, Michigan during the 60s and 70s. It was very turbulent. And there was kind of this impotence of being a kid, not knowing what one can do to try and affect positive change. I knew I wanted to, but I didn't know how. And it wasn't until I went to college at Wayne State University that one of my professors gave me this book by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, and it was called Psychic Exploration. And that book literally changed my life. It was, so interesting to me to think that the next great paradigm shift would be consciousness and these latent potentials. And so that really set me on an odyssey. I went to, different schools, I went to different research foundations. I worked with the best of the best in these fields. And so that was what really started me. I went to the Institute for Parapsychology. I worked with Bob Morris out in California. I worked with Ed May at the Science Applications International Corporation. Had my little run with the CIA DIA program on remote viewing. Um, Landed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford, which was really, a great and powerful experience. And then I got recruited to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was really interesting because that was the organization that Edgar Mitchell had founded. I didn't apply for the job. And so somehow there was kind of this full circle of Edgar Mitchell's work and then, my journey. And then I left there after about 25 years and made a documentary with Deepak Chopra, wrote a book on Death Makes Life Possible, and ended up teaching. I'm now at Sophia University, where I work with PhD students in transpersonal psychology and continue to do research, continue to live the life.
So throughout all of these positions that you've held, you've done research. Talk to us more about the kind of research you've done and what you learned.
I've done all kinds of research. It's been a passion for me. I started, I guess, with remote viewing. It was right at the time when Targ and Puthoff had published their book, Mind Reach, and I started working with one of the professors at the university, and we were dabbling more than anything. And we were really getting some interesting results. And I thought, oh, this is fascinating. Um, and what we found is that we, as the researchers, were having more success in the studies than if we brought in psychics or people who claimed to have these experiences. And that was something that, really stayed with me throughout my career. I did Gansfeld research. I worked with Charles Honorton at the Psychical Research Laboratory in Princeton. I worked with William Broad and Helmut Schmidt at the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas. It was with William that I started doing psychic healing research, and he and I developed some protocols for studying distant intention and whether one person's intention could influence the physiology of another person at a distance. And we did 14 formal randomized controlled trials. And we found significant support for this idea of intention at a distance. And then during that time, I got a PhD in social anthropology, and I did a master's in social science. And I kind of converged with the quantitative work that happens in a laboratory with the qualitative dimensions of, what an anthropologist would do. I went and worked with Ed May, and we did remote staring studies with the SRI trained remote viewing group. That was a really wonderful experience. And then when I went to IONS, I continued doing healing research, continued doing the remote staring work, worked with some skeptics, and we did collaborations looking at what would happen when the experimenters themselves had different worldviews, different belief systems, found that that really did make a difference, even when, we were working under controlled circumstances. So, and now I am doing research with the psychomantium and looking at these transpersonal states, these experiences that people have of what we're calling invisible others. And does that have healing potentials?
So you used a couple of words that our folks, me included, might not be so familiar with, like, and I'm going to pronounce it. You said Gansfeld research?
Gansfeld. So it's a
Gansfeld.
German word that means whole field. And it was a study that was created based on the successes of people's experiences of psychic phenomena during sleep or altered states of consciousness. And so it's basically a sensory deprivation procedure where they use these kind of halved ping pong balls. And you put them over somebody's eyes and they shine a red light over you. So you're sitting in this dark, quiet room, actually listening to white noise, just a kind of staticky sound. And pretty soon, with your eyes open, but not having any sensory input, it turns into this whole dark field. And because your eyes are open and because the brain is hardwired to see things, people would start seeing imagery. So we did a study with students from the Juilliard School, Performing Arts in New York, and we brought the students into the lab, and we had a person in one room who was looking at short video clips. And we had a person, one of the Juilliard students, in the other room in the Gansfeld. So what would happen is we would randomly select a pool of 4 video clips and then randomly select one of those from the pool. So a person was sitting there watching the video clip, and the person in the Gansfeld was describing their experience. So, for example, one of the sessions, the person in the sender, if you want to play with that kind of metaphor, was watching a film clip from The Wiz, which is a parody of The Wizard of Oz. So Diana Ross, and you've got the Golden Gate Bridge. It's not the Golden Gate Bridge, it was the Bay Bridge, and it was tinted golden, so the yellow brick road kind of thing. And so the person describes a hot air balloon, a black female nightclub performer, a lion, a wizard, a dog, and so at the end of the session, that person in the Gansfeld takes off the
Ping pong.
goggles, and they're shown the 4 video clips. Only one of them was the correct one, but they don't know which one that is. And this person had no problem at all picking first place, the Wiz clip. And so we did that in the standard Gansfeld. We found that it was about 32% of people were successful. And you'd expect 25% based on chance because it's a probability of 1 in 4. So in the Juilliard study, we found a 50% success rate.
Oh my,
So
that's amazing.
yeah, it was highly successful. And the quality of the imagery was like what I just described. Um, and then with the classically trained musicians, we found a 75% success rate. So there was something about this creative population, in particular the classically trained musicians, the qualitative pieces like that image of the hot air balloon panning over just when the person's watching it in the video clip. Those images mostly came from the drama students, and they were very dramatic in their experiences. But the discernment piece, that judging piece where you had to pick out which of the 4 was the correct one, that was the classically trained musicians. So it shows that there are kind of different talents in this. There's one is the discrimination, the ability to take the imagery I had and say, oh yeah, that matches that image. And then there's the quality of the experience, which was more, being able to describe these facets of the video. So that was a really great experiment. So that was one Gansfeld.
I
That's
love it. And you used another term I wasn't familiar with, which is remote staring. I know remote viewing. How is remote staring the same or different?
right. So people throughout history describe this feeling of maybe tingles up the back of the neck, and they look over and someone is staring at them. And so the question is that due to peripheral vision? We know that our brains are hardwired to detect motion, and that comes from, evolution, um, survival. And so we were really interested in, is it something more? Is there kind of an X factor that enhances people's perception of someone gazing at them? And so we had a video camera on one person, and we had another person in another room staring at their image via closed circuit television. And sometimes they were staring at them, and sometimes they weren't. So again, we used this kind of random procedure so that the person being stared at didn't know when that was going to happen. And we could measure the average amount of physiological activity during the staring periods as compared to the control periods, with the idea that you might think people become agitated or that their autonomic nervous system, that tingling up the back of the neck thing, um, could be activated and measured. And we were very successful with that. We found that there were significant differences in the average amount of physiological activity when someone was staring at them from a distance as compared to the control conditions. So again, it suggests that there's something about consciousness that moves beyond just our physicality, and that this is something that science can actually look at and measure and control and and seek to understand better what these potentials are.
In the world of near death, we talk a lot about intention, about how when people are in, the non-physical universe, that's how they move around. It's just intention. And then when they come back to the physical universe, they discover how intention is just critical to how we move about in the physical universe and organize the events that happen to us via intention. And I was really taken by the fact that you've studied this in a healing modality. Tell us a little more about that, because this just gets me all excited.
Well, I think intention is fundamental. From the moment you wake up in the morning and decide to put your feet on the floor, that is you being motivated or moving toward a goal and harnessing your intention. We can think about intention as self-healing. I'm bringing my awareness. It doesn't always work. I'm not saying that I think it's, the definitive solution to all things. But the studies we've done also look at this idea that intention may be something non-local, um, beyond the body. And so that's what we've been trying to study in a laboratory setting.
And what did you find out?
Well, the research that I've done is very supportive of the idea that we can harness our intention in ways that, um, as I said, can be measured, that have an effect on another person's biology. We know from cross-cultural reports that healers describe their capacity to harness their intention to influence another person.
Mhm.
And it can be for good, like in a healing response. It can be in the negative. We hear about these shamanic cultures where there's sorcery, for example. And so is that just, wishful thinking, a cultural belief system, or is there a way in which science can uh, give us information about what's going on there? And I think at this point we have more a proof of principle that there's something going on, that people do seem to have this capacity to harness their intention to direct it towards some object or outcome. Not 100%, doesn't always work, but it works to a statistically significant degree. And my studies have been very supportive of that. On the other hand, I've done studies, for example, I did a set of studies with Richard Wiseman. And Richard is a social psychologist, a magician, and a card-carrying member of the skeptical community. And he and I did these studies together where we worked with the same population, the same experimental setup, the same outcomes, the same statistics, and we got different results. Um, and so that said something about the intention and the beliefs of the experimenter as well. So it's not only the direct harnessing of intention, but it may well be that there's something about this broader, field of science that we're creating that may have some measurable capacities.
You mentioned earlier about worldviews and how important that is, and that kind of fits in here, I think. So tell us, what's a worldview and how's it important in this consciousness arena?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by worldviews. I have always been, and I think that there's just so much to be learned there, that's relevant to our contemporary times. We have all these biases, we have these cultural conditionings. And I think about worldview as like the lens of perception through which we see the world.
Yep.
But it's fundamental to how we interpret and engage the world in every way, and yet it's largely invisible. We are mostly not aware that we have one. So we have this um, realm of perception. Think about it as a set of glasses, and um, we don't know that we have it, and yet it's creating our biases, our perceptions, our beliefs, the ways in which we engage other people, engage the world. And so to become more aware of what we're not aware of, I think is a really important, skill set, really. And that's one of the things, we know now that we have all these cognitive biases that limit our capacity to see the world as it is because we're seeing it through this filtering process. And so how do we, become more skillful in recognizing that when we're being reactive towards something, that maybe that's not about the real situation, but about our priming. Maybe it's our, childhood development, maybe it's our education, maybe it's, just something about how we're hardwired. But I think that worldview is really fundamental. And so if you think about it in the context of these kinds of experiences, if people's worldview is primed to perceive the world in a broader way, then they're probably going to see the world in a broader way because that's how we're oriented. And so that's why I think it's important for understanding intention. If I think that my intention has powers and potentials to impact myself and impact the world I live in, then it's more likely that I'm going to perceive that. And then if our data are true and right, that may be that we're able to affect the world.
I'm um, struck by this because in near-death research, of course, when people come back having had a near-death experience or a shared death experience, their worldview is profoundly changed, and they look at the world with entirely different lens than they had going in. So, you know, you're preaching to the choir here. Um, So, have you done work on helping people to broaden or change their worldview, or anything in that realm of things?
I think you're bringing up a good point about near death or out of body experiences. It often isn't accompanied by an intention. It may be completely unexpected. I didn't know this was going to happen, and suddenly I got jolted into a different, view of what's possible. Um, the answer is yes. We did a 10-year study looking at transformations in worldview. We invited people to tell us their stories. Have you ever had an experience that, you know, fundamentally changed your perception of reality? And we found that people had many different kinds of experiences that shifted them. It could be as mundane as washing the dishes, looking out the window, and suddenly having this sense that something was different. It could be as profound as a near-death experience. It could be, it almost always was some kind of um, difficult situation. So the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, um, some kind of, trauma in their lives. Not always. Sometimes it was just a pure ecstasy experience, some sense of awe or wonder about the universe. But it often involves something that was kind of radical and shook people out of their steady state. People have options when that happens. They can harness those biases and shut it down, and just continue to muddle along. Or they can think, maybe there's something more. And there's that kind of curiosity that comes. And so we looked at all of that. We looked at what triggers or stimulates a transformative experience, what sustains it, what are the practices that people can engage in, what are the consequences of that. And so from all of that, we did a book called Living Deeply, The Art and Science of Transformation. And we created a change model that looked at, the triggers, which I just mentioned. Um, if people are able to harness the curiosity, then how do they begin to inquire about the world and what are the things they've been missing? Practices. So we interviewed masters from 60 different traditions, and we found that, people had different kinds of practices, obviously, whether it was a Catholic priest or a Wiccan, they had different tools that they used, but there were principles that they all had in common. Intention was one. And yet we know the road to hell can be paved with good intention. And so that alone is not enough. Attention. So these practices help us to shift our awareness. And it's like, as we've been saying, the brain can be hardwired to see things a certain way. These practices can help people to pull away from the rigidity and, harness a different perception. So the glass can be half full instead of half empty. There is repetition. So building different muscles, just like you would go to a gym and harness, a particular muscle group. Well, the same is true for these kind of transformative practices. I am going to learn to see the world differently. And it's not always going to be that way. And so repetition can help us to build those capacities. Guidance. The teachers and the people we interviewed talked about how important having somebody who's been on the road before us who can help guide us, the teacher, or it can be, listening to a podcast and getting an idea, a eureka moment, and it's also internal guidance. It's that, North Star, and we begin to calibrate our own guidance system and how much we can rely on that. And then the fifth factor in these practices is kind of a surrender. Um, the world is what it is, and I can perceive it. Um, and I'm not always going to change it. And, we die. We have these bad experiences. So how do I become more resilient? How do I develop the capacities to manage the stresses and the fears and the terrors that come? Those are really important pieces that these transformative practices help us with. And then there's this idea that, it's not all about the practice, it's getting out into the world and applying it. So, one of the teachers, I think it was Angeles Arian, she said, you've got to get off the pillow and get out into the world. You've got to get off the pew and get out into the world. And so living your practice becomes important. And then I think finally, how do we take these insights that come from these transformative experiences, the shift in our worldview, this understanding that there are these potentials within us. How do we apply that in the world so that we can, begin to nurture our schools, our health systems, our businesses, our communities? How do we bring these insights into ways of trying to create a better world?
I am struck with that healing thing you talked about because I know folks that have had near death experiences and their worldview has shifted and they've closed it down. They said, I'm in a spot where I just can't do that anymore. I don't understand it, or my community won't understand. Anyway, when they shut it down, they get sick. And have you seen that in your research about how, person's worldview can actually influence their health?
I haven't studied that directly, but I'm sure that's true because if we're resisting and we're having anxiety or stress, that definitely, shows up in people's immune systems or endocrine systems. We know that if people can, breathe into whatever their experience is, that's that surrender piece. Um, Minimizing the anxiety, enhancing the resilience can be very health promoting. And at the same time, be the opposite.
Right. Um, you mentioned, well, on this channel, we're all about near death and shared death experiences. So I know that you've done some work about death awareness. And so tell us about that and how we in this culture do that and how other cultures do it. I know this is a passion for you.
Ernest Becker wrote this book. He won a Pulitzer for it, Denial of Death. And, the fact that people resist what is inevitable, and then what kind of anxiety, what kind of terror manifests as a result of that. And ultimately, what kind of maladaptive behaviors come from that resistance? And, people become more aggressive. They become more hostile. They gain a greater appreciation for the in-group, but then, a hostility toward the out-group. And we see this all the time, all the conflicts, all the genocide, the racism, the intolerance that we have toward others. And a lot of that can become hardwired because of this resistance we have to our own mortality. His work led to a group of social psychologists developing what they called terror management theory. And this was really about people's ability to recognize their own mortality and to then shift their behavior. And so they've done all these really interesting experiments. These social psychologists are very clever. It's kind of my favorite group of, researchers, very clever people. And, they've looked at what happens when you trigger somebody's death awareness and they're not prepared for it. And what can happen is they make bad choices. They make
Oh,
choices that are
really?
very aggressive toward other people. On the other hand, if you can prepare them, if you can enhance their self-esteem and their awareness of their own, goodness, that can lead to pro-social behaviors. So there's something very powerful about, death anxiety, and then how do we learn to manage it? And how can we work on our own inner strengths? And again, going back to these transformative practices, what can we learn from these different transformative communities and these different traditions that can help us? I created this film with Deepak Chopra, Death Makes Life Possible, and then did a book. We have another book coming out in the fall. It'll be enhanced with some of the new information about near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. Um, but what we can see is that if people can look at this and then begin to engage in conversation about it, it's not as scary. And we've taken this idea and the film all over the world now. I just completed a whole series of trainings in China, and I've done it in Taiwan, Japan, all over the United States, South America. And what we see is this kind of fear and anxiety around death is very widespread. It's not just in our materialist culture. It is in a lot of places. And yet there are these traditions, there are these practices that people have developed for minimizing that anxiety and enhancing our curiosity about, what happens after. And so we know that the world is filled with different traditions that have different approaches to that. And we also know that it's a widespread problem in in the world. So what we've done is to create, with the film and a facilitator guide and a program where people can invite folks to come in, view the film, ponder their own perceptions and reactions. And by and large, having a safe place to have these conversations is very beneficial. And we have actually measured how it shifts people's perceptions. One of the things we saw in the training is that people can move from this sense of me, I, my first person pronoun, to a broader sense of a we. And so people shift from their own kind of narcissism to a broader sense of engagement with, a world beyond ourselves. And that can be very powerful for, reducing that sense of anxiety and fear.
Okay, we're going long, but there is a topic that has me all curious, and I know you're studying, and that is the psychomantium. And sorry to shift gears so quickly, but I want to be sure that we talk about this. So tell us, what is a psychomantium, and what's it useful for, and why should we love it?
Or should we love
Oh, yeah, there you go.
it? Well, throughout history, people have practiced different kinds of divination, and they've developed different procedures for, harnessing our creative imagination, engaging in these kind of metaphysical, transpersonal realms that are beyond just our physical awareness. Maybe it's scrying, staring into a reflective surface and with intention, communicating with the invisible world, as it were. We've seen it, the Greek oracles, used it as a way of connecting with the supernatural, the divine, the gods and goddesses. And they would use it for prognostication. They would use it to um, determine whether, they would have visitors. Would the visitors be friendly? If they were in battle, where would be the most successful place to engage? These were some of the kinds of questions that they were asking. We find it in most cultures that there are certain practices. Some of the indigenous cultures throw the bones, for example, and then they
Right.
look to have these oracular kind of experiences. So the psychomantium is based on that kind of, ancient practice. And it was brought into our contemporary culture by Raymond Moody, who's a psychiatrist, was really working with a lot of his patients who had grief. This real profound sense of loss over, the death of a loved one. And was there a way that you could use this divination practice to have those final conversations that you'd never had, and therefore to kind of begin to close some of the pain and the suffering that people experienced? So he brought that into a clinical setting, and he found that it was very therapeutic, that people, were assuaged of some of their grief by having these conversations. And so scientists started to ask, well, is there something we can do with this in a laboratory setting? At the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, now Sophia University, Arthur Hastings was one of the researchers, and he created a little chamber in the lab and brought people in and looked at whether there were changes in their psychology as a result of experiencing the psychomantium. And so, in particular, he was measuring grief. So if people were brought into this setting, it's a darkened room, you have a mirror, so a reflective surface, barely illuminated with a candle. Um, and people aren't seeing themselves, but they're seeing the illumination of the mirror. And they're given the suggestion to have a conversation, to communicate with a departed loved one. Did that enhance their healing process? Could it reduce their sense of grief? And he found that it did. And in particular, the deeper a person went, the more absorbed they could get in the experience, the stronger the effect was. So we started working with this. I compared that physical chamber, the room, with virtual reality. So I was interested in how we can harness this ancient set of practices with modern technology. And so we compared the virtual reality with the physical chamber. We didn't find a significant difference in the kinds of impact that people had. But we did find that people, the deeper they went, the greater the impact was on their grief experience. And we also found that people reported various modalities. So it wasn't just talking to somebody. It was, you could hear voices, but you could also have a sensation. Maybe it's, people talk about the chill in the air. Um, People described smells. One woman described going into her grandmother's living room. Her grandmother was deceased, and smelling the living room and feeling the connection to her grandmother as a result of that olfactory connection. So we really looked at different kinds of sensory experiences, and it covered a broad spectrum. Um, and so one of the things we saw is that people wanted to do more. Many people described just starting to get a sense of it. And so going back to these kind of practices, the more you practice, the stronger the experience. We find this in transformative work. And so the current study that we're doing is what we're calling talent and training. So the talent we're looking at is high and low absorption. How deeply are people going to get into this experience? And then the practice is multiple sessions. So we're using the virtual reality. We're inviting people who are high and low on absorption. And then we're asking them to participate in 3 sessions. And we're looking to see if there's a difference between the beginning when they're just trying to get comfortable with this experience, and then finally the third session. And so, we're actually actively recruiting people right now for this. If people have a virtual reality Oculus type headset, we can work with people from their homes. Um, it might be something that different groups want to play with in their communities. So that's what we're looking at. And we're measuring psychological changes. We're measuring whether there's a connection between people's sense of awe. Is there something awe-inspiring about these experiences? And does that correlate with, you know, a reduction in their grief? So, we're looking at this as a way of studying these extended states of consciousness, these transpersonal experiences that take us beyond our own physicality, and looking to see whether there are ways that this can enhance our sense of healing and well-being.
So when you're using an Oculus, what are people looking at? You know,
In this study, we created a reflective pool of water.
oh, okay.
So I consulted with a world-class hypnotherapist, and he helped me to create a guided imagery, so creative imagination. So we lead people into their imagination, and we invite them to gaze in a reflective way into this beautiful surface of water. And then that shifts to a kind of amorphous image. So they then begin to use their own projection. And so the experience, and then they describe what they're experiencing. So that's, what happens. There's both this kind of self-hypnosis, guided imagery, using the reflective surface, just like in the ancient traditions, and then, measuring changes using psychometrics.
Got it. And you made the invitation for, if people would like to participate, how would they do that?
So people just need to send me an email. They can send it to my Sophia email address, and I'm sure you can post that. It's marilyn.schlitz@sophia.edu.
Oh,
And
that's easy. Okay.
yeah. And my assistant Paul will probably get back to people. It may be somebody else because we have a little team of people that are working on this. But yeah, we're very excited to work with people and just to engage people's imaginations.
I love it. So we're at the end, which means, do you have like a final thought that you would like to impart to folks as your um, goodbye message?
I am extremely interested right now in how these ideas, which can seem kind of fringe or um, out of our ordinary experience. How can we learn from them in ways that make us better citizens, make us better humans? How can we recognize that when we become reactive, when we get really, upset? Take road rage, for example. We hear about that. We don't have it as much in other cultures, but certainly in our Western culture, people get very reactive. It takes different forms in different cultures. But how can you recognize that there's an old part of the brain that gets triggered? There's that fight or flight, but we can control that. And as we start thinking about these powers and potentials of our consciousness, how can we invite in the learning and the compassion and the empathy? Maybe that person who drove by and cut us off is having their own sort of personal drama today. How can we find that way of calming that amygdala in our brains and becoming kinder people. That's ultimately, I think we're living at a time when there's so much disharmony. How can we invite a greater sense of unity, compassion, love, and, gratefulness? All of those are skills that I think we can learn and bring into our daily lives.
Marilyn, that is wonderful. And we're going to have you back just to talk about that one subject because that's near and dear to my heart, and it certainly is needed right now in this crazy world that we live in.
So true.
How do people find out more about you and the work that you do?
Well, I have a website, marilynschlitz.com. I try to keep it up to date as best as possible, and that's probably the best way. I'll take this interview if I have your permission, and we'll post that up there. I have a lot of, events that I'm doing. I'm doing a workshop on elegant aging at the Esalen Institute in July. And that also takes into consideration these principles of transformation. So how do we take, our own life journey and begin to think about how I can approach it with kindness toward myself and kindness toward others? So I'm out there, I'm doing stuff, I'm teaching at Sophia, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. You asked great questions. Thank you.
Marilyn, you're a hoot. Thank you for being with us here on the Afterlife Files. And those of you that are watching, please stick around because I've got a couple of things that I want to give some insight to. So we'll see you on the flip side. Thank you again, Marilyn.
Bye. Thank you.
Do you remember in our conversation that experiment where Dr. Marilyn Schlitz put ping pong balls over people's eyes and then fed them sensory deprivation kind of sound things? And then those people who were in this kind of a cocoon thing could read the mind, read the experience of a person in another room with a video going on. They were watching a video. And then they had to choose, from four which ones they were actually working. I love this interview, this part of the interview, because this experiment, I think, really does a nice job of saying how we are a microcosm of the macrocosm, that what we experience and learn is exported up into the consciousness, the collective consciousness of all humans, and it's accessible to all of us, so that a person who is meditating could actually pick up what another person was viewing and experiencing. I think it's an experiment that's not difficult to run, and it does a nice way of proving for ourselves that this concept is real, this collective human consciousness is real. This experiment pointed out to us another thing, which is that, how we are trained, whether we're a dancer or an actor or a classically trained musician, that gives us a certain pathway, a certain neural pathway that allows us to pick up on certain types of information that the collective consciousness has. I happen to like using binaural beats to help us open up and train our minds to pick up these kinds of information that is available to us from the collective. So whether it's my course or somebody else, you might want to give that a try because, being a classically trained musician might be helpful, but it takes a really long time. And binaural beats, you can put on the headphones, enter the space, and with regular training that's easy to learn, you could do that sort of thing and prove to yourself that the collective consciousness exists and we have access to it. Thank you for being with us at the Afterlife Files, and we'll see you next time.